Good afternoon and welcome. This is the 2020 pandemic edition of Democracy Days. Thank you for being here. My name is Michael Kelker. I teach English at St. Charles Community College. I've also been the organizer of Democracy Days 2001 to present. One of my favorite things about Democracy Days through the years has been our panel sessions, and we have an outstanding panel lined up for this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. We pick up a whole lot of great new information from an interdisciplinary set of perspectives. And I turn it over to our historian on the panel, Grace Moser. Grace, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to thank Michael for putting together Democracy Days. This is the 20th anniversary, and it's so amazing. I looked back through my records, and I've been participating since 2013, which is really exciting. And every year I try to think of what my angle is going to be for a Democracy Days presentation. And then this year, Michael sent me an email saying, Grace, what are you going to do? And I was like, oh, yes, I need to think of something. And just off the top of my head, I started thinking about a new course that we're offering at St. Charles this year for the first time ever in our 35 plus year history on campus, which is African American history. And I started thinking about how important this class is in light of everything that's happened over this past summer with George Floyd and with the Black Lives Matters protests, and realized that since my involvement, I really became fully aware of all this in when I was in college, and I was talking to some of my Black friends, and we were talking about Ferguson police officers. And they were telling me that their experience was completely different than my experience as a white person. And then a few years later, or like 8 years later, Mike Brown happened. And then I realized that there is a disconnect in our society of the African-American experience. And that's when a lot of us started having hard conversations like about the talk that Black parents have with their kids. And I realized that we don't really understand our own history, particularly the history that's taught to us in our classroom does not include the African-American perspective very often. As white people, our experience has been largely just slavery and, sorry, my cat's being loud in the background, slavery and the civil rights movement. And then that's it. Racism is resolved, and there's nothing else that's in our education, apart from just a month in February where we learned about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and that's about it. So I made this panel called It's All Our History, because all of this is American history. Everything is American history. We need to learn the whole perspective. We need to take those classes that will give us African-American literature, African-American experience, African-American perspectives. It's not just African-American history in and of itself, it's everything. And what I'm really excited about today is the presenters on this panel are presenting multiple applications for understanding the African-American perspective, how it can impact your career, how it can impact your life. And this is everything from literature to the medical field. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. I'll introduce them all to you, and then I'll let them talk a little bit to you. Our first presenter is going to be Rachel McWhorter Rush. She is an English professor here on campus. She teaches African-American literature, pioneered that class for our campus. I don't believe it was taught prior to her coming here. Next is going to be Dana Prewitt. She is our sociology professor here on campus. She's a newer face, but we're very excited to have her. We're buddies, we Zoom a lot. And then next we have Courtney Barrett, who is our occupational therapy professor here on campus. She's going to be giving a medical perspective on things. And I'm very excited Courtney agreed, because I think this is a part of the question that is incredibly relevant to today, especially in the medical industry, about understanding African-American experiences and incorporating that into your career. And then finally, last but not least, we have Professor Marvin Tobias, who's one of our psychology faculty here on campus. And I've known Marvin for a long time, so I'm really excited to hear him speak today. We've done lots of presentations with each other for Democracy Days. So now I'll turn it over to Rachel. And Rachel, if you want to take it, you can.
Great. Glad to have all of y'all here, though we can't see you. I'm going to shift my screen over to presentation. Actually, here we go. All right, let's see. So as Grace mentioned, I do teach English here at St. Charles Community College, which includes literature and English 101. Well, let me put this on present mode. How does that sound? And I wanted to talk about, I think it lays a nice foundation across the disciplines to think about how, as I'll put it, interwoven into our actual stories, we have racism. I mean, that's our inheritance as Americans, frankly. And it is something that we don't talk about as much. It's certainly coming up more now, but this has always been true and been with us. So I do want to start with a poem. Have to, I'm an English teacher, right? This is just a quick stanza. I have this on my door in my office in humanities. It's one of my favorites that just kind of keeps perspective on this. And it's from Michael S. Harper's book of poetry, Song I Want to Witness. I've got the picture there, the cover. But if you'll be patient, I'm just going to read it for you here. When there is no history, there is no metaphor. A blind nation in storm mauls its own harbors. Sperm whale, Indian, black, belted in these ruins. I don't want to turn this necessarily into us unpacking a poem, but I think it stands so much on its own here to show that we can't move forward. We can't even acknowledge our identities fully if we're not reckoning with history, which is inevitably a part of us. It's whether we're bringing it to the fore. And as I said, we're talking about the prevalence of racism in American history. It is embedded in all that we speak and do. And English, I think, just I'm a little biased, but we do a pretty good job, at least, of carefully considering how these kinds of narratives inform anything from our personal decisions to our institutional issues across the board. So let me give you a little wall of text here, just this one slide that'll be this way, but I wanted to give us a foundation, if we're going to talk about English, sort of our disciplinary perspective when we're looking at history and stories, which are both really important to us. So where humans are involved, complete objectivity is an impossibility. Even in the sciences, right? You pick what you're going to study. You have your human elements involved. And now I think us in humanities, we don't see this as a shortcoming by any means, but it's something we have to reckon with, that all human creations contain a residue of our personal context and biases, but also that of the societal institutions that we're a part of, that we're influenced by. You've probably heard the fish in water thing, like don't ever ask a fish what the water's like, right? They've been in it their whole lives, they're immersed, they don't know what water is. In a sense, that's how these kinds of invisible things work. Now, obviously, privilege will temper this. I, as a white as Wonder Bread woman, might have a very different experience and will with racism than someone who is darker complected in our society, and this would not be an invisibility. But unfortunately, our mainstream institutions still are largely whitewashed. So that's how this has worked. Racism is inherently in the American literary canon. And when we even say canon, right, we'll talk about that, but it's problematic. What books do we see as being worthy of study? What poems and authors' names get name dropped in academic circles? We can't keep politics or history out of what we read and think. It's always already there. And to turn away from it would simply prevent ourselves from seeing the whole story or the truth. English as a discipline has a unique relationship to truth, and particularly apprehending it through stories. I've got here on the side that truth can be found in fiction. I always think it's funny to consider that in English, we literally sit and study lies, right? To a large extent, we are reading about fabricated people in plays, novels, even poetry. But that's obviously not to say that these are without truths. And I like how this flips, I think, a lot of our sort of rational-based society of like, where do you find truth? How do you apprehend it? And so we kind of cast that notion, well, all human engagements are kind of a text, right? We compose them deliberately for an audience. There's a power dynamic involved. So we need to address the undercurrent, the discourses involved in there. Truths can come from both fictions and facts, and we've got to be careful about how we neatly separate those two. They're not as clear as we would like. And lastly, of course, words aren't neutral and silences aren't either. Always think about whose stories, whose voices do we have? Which ones are omitted? How are they cast? This can be very complicated and nuanced, but it's powerful. And English itself, while it brings all these great things to the fore, is absolutely guilty of these same, of course, it's a product of the same society, right, that it's critiquing. So there are a lot of dead white male guys that you will read about in English. You know, the old canon, it's getting better, but it's got a long way to go. And the kinds of privilege those stories tell and basically eclipse are prevalent. Racism is there among it. All right, so what do we do? And I'm going to give you some stuff. There are so many more things. This is just a brief introduction of some things that I teach currently in English 101 or in my Lit survey courses. But you know, just a few. So you might have heard, I bet you have at this point, by The Danger of a Single Story, a TED Talk that went pretty viral from, I think, 2009. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, an amazing writer and speaker in so many ways, but this particular quick piece, I really recommend. I show it every semester in my class. And this woman is an amazing Nigerian writer, but she talks about her childhood and how she would write stories that would be populated by children playing in the cold snow and eating crisp apples. This, a young girl growing in Nigeria, those things would have not been a part of her life. So in other words, her whole imaginary creation was just a representation of that sort of Western European literary tradition that she'd read. I mean, we talk about representation a lot, but think of how fundamentally this will impact people. And I will leave that for our social scientists to explore more, but the power of having diverse stories cannot be overemphasized. And then I also have, of course, Toni Morrison here. She has a particular book called Playing in the Dark, where she does masterfully, as she does everything, she shows us how the literary tradition, even the seemingly dead white guy literary tradition of Hemingway and Fitzgerald, actually has racism mapped into it. It is reliant on an unspoken but steady truth of first slavery and then the inheritance of racism that leaves us from the Jim Crow era onward and to this day. And I love this quote from her, that the contemplation of this Black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of the literary imagination. We'll talk a lot about margins in English. And of course, you think of that nice white inch of space you got in one word, but there's so much more to that. What does it mean to have the central focus and those at the margins, right? Bringing the voices that have been seen just on the periphery, just as an additive, and realizing, no, they're an integral part of the main story and always have been. To say anything less would be missing the point of the story entirely. I wanted to bring a visual here too, that I like to use in class. Now, this painting is called Behind the Myth of Benevolence. It's by Titus Kaphar from 2014. And you might recognize, it literally looks like one of those presidential portraits. This is Thomas Jefferson, and it's folded back. The canvas, just such a brilliant, he does a lot of these actually, but showing that dimension behind, which is meant to make us think of Sally Hemings. Now, I've noticed lately a lot more students are familiar with Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's complicated past, as all of our so-called founding fathers had. And I would argue alongside reading, say, the Declaration of Independence, you need to get notes on the state of Virginia, where Jefferson specifically talks about racial divide and suggests, despite his own romantic liaisons that we know with Sally and her family intimately involved in his own, that he feels those of African descent will never be equal, are not fully human in the same capacity as white people. I mean, it's complicated and it needs to be addressed. So in this, I love how it says that you need to consider alongside Jefferson, Hemings. And we will notice there's some artistic license. I mean, many have historically said Sally Hemings was lighter complected and able even to pass. But the point here is the artist is really drawn to stark contrast. What is behind this story, right? What is behind the so-called American values that uphold our nation, the labor of enslaved people to start with, and the rape of women and proliferation of the system of slavery. So I really liked this quotation here on this piece, the revealing the unseen. Love that. Positioning behind a white man, a powerful US president who wrote the Declaration of Independence, sets the stage for a world of metaphors for the viewer to unravel. We love our metaphors. The artist points out fundamental problems in representation, then trusts his audience to create the narrative form. So even this we can read as a narrative. This is telling us so much more as she's pushing back that white face, but all that goes with it, all the baggage of Thomas Jefferson and our nation's founding to expose a truth long denied. All right, keep on going. I don't want to take too long. All right. Alongside this, English addresses the fact that our access to telling stories, articulating ourselves in words, and having that valued and heard has always had problems as well. The very history, as I put here, of storytelling in the US is far from democratic and rooted in a limited access to literacy. And I like to do a unit on this in my English 101 class. And I feature these three writers, and here's some quotations that we talk about. For instance, Frederick Douglass, who, as you may know, was born an enslaved man, grew up and actually was able to seek freedom from slavery. He wrote his first autobiography in 1849, of course, while slavery was still legal in the United States before the Civil War. And there's such a fabulous turning point in that autobiography. Please read it if you haven't. It's this central moment where he's fighting back against Covey. And he says, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." And it always gives me chills. It's where the story shifts, and it shows the power of Frederick Douglass, who was legally forced to be illiterate as a slave, as a child. And yet he articulates his story. He's sharing his story, the rhetoric of his piece, and in fact, hoping to bring more abolitionists on board, more privileged white population to see the evils of slavery and to show his humanness, which of course was denied in that illegal, making literacy illegal. And then you have Malcolm X, over a century later, having a similar encounter with literacy. Despite having gone to public school and obviously not being a literal slave, Malcolm X shares in his autobiography, which is also phenomenal, done with Alex Haley of Roots. He shares a little bit about how he learns to read in prison and how he discovers the history, the unspoken history of non-white people. And this is what really gives him the righteous rage to be an activist when he gets out. And he says, "I've often reflected upon the new vistas that reading opened to me. I knew right there in prison that reading had changed forever the course of my life. As I see it today, the ability to read awoke inside me some long dormant craving to be mentally alive." He attributed his alma mater as books in that piece, which is lovely. And lastly on here, Alice Walker, she has a fantastic piece, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she broadens this further and says it's not just literacy, but it's that artistic, creative expression of human self that has been stifled and denied, particularly for Black women who were enslaved and inherited this sort of caretaking role that was often undervalued, still undervalued in terms of payment to this day. And she looks to other examples, including this really fabulous example of a quilt hanging in the Smithsonian that is simply attributed to a female slave from Alabama. They don't know her name. There's been some search done on this though, but it makes me think, shouldn't our anthologies have that quilt featured in it? Why is that not a part of the canon? And she says, "I believe that the truth of any subject only comes when all sides of the story are put together. I write all the things I should have been able to read." Which also makes me think of Toni Morrison. If there's a story you want to read and it isn't written out there, you need to go out and write it. Add that voice yourself. All right. So I'm going to make sure I'm doing okay on time here. Okay. So our parting thought from English, and I'd like, once we go to a Q&A, obviously these kinds of things about writing and sharing voice are dependent on lots of other features, like the materiality of race, from healthcare to education. And that's what a lot of my colleagues here are going to talk about. So all of this informs each other. And two main things in English, though, that we're looking at that I'm curious your thoughts on, where we go from here. What kind of democratic dialogue does it look like? So on the one hand, we have, and Grace mentioned, and I did take to curriculum and start the class African-American literature, and she has started African-American history, both previously not offered here at the college. And this is an important measure. Ethnic literature studies in general have been on the rise, really since the 1970s. But as important as they are, what is the next step? We need them, but I feel like we're not landing in the how, for instance, in American Lit, do we keep American Lit sort of reified as this white thing and African-American Lit is over here? I think we need a both and plan. And curriculum is political too, right? So the fact that I believe, and Grace can speak to this, that African-American history can be taken in place of American History Survey, which is an amazing move. We don't have that in the literature side of things. I think that would be a great way to go. Thinking about it as a requirement or an add-on course. And secondly, I think a lot of good-natured stuff is here, and me as hopefully trying to be a white activist, I fall in this camp too and try to check myself, but empathy and cultural appropriation. Can we ever truly walk a mile in someone's shoes? And would we even want to, in the sense that who gets intimate access to other people's stories? That's a privilege too. And there's some interesting arguments out there about how empathy, while an important goal to reach, is itself also not enough, right? We might do, and I'm saying I'm a white person up here, like to read a story about Harriet Jacobs fleeing slavery. I get a little nervous when students will say, well, I would have done blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, I don't know that we can put ourselves in that position. I don't know that that lends real value and dignity to the story. So is it some sort of model of compassion, moving beyond just empathy? Because sometimes empathy can become kind of claiming someone's story, right? Putting ourselves in it like, yeah, now I understand this. I spent the night at a homeless shelter. I know what that's like. These things make me very nervous. And so thinking about what we wanted, how does empathy look? How do we veer away from cultural appropriation or completely overtaking or eclipsing the individual that was already, disenfranchised? We're trying to lend a voice to it, right? And again, I say we, those with power often aren't those that are marginalized, trying to get their voices more centralized. It's something I just like for us to think about and talk about as the discipline moves forward, as it impacts all of us really in our storytelling. So that is the completion of my presentation. There's just a quick list of the sources, because what kind of English teacher would I be if I didn't have that for y'all? There, and I believe I'm turning this over to my colleague, Dr. Dana Prewitt is up next, so take it away, Dana. Sorry, Dana, you're muted.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Rachel. So in terms of approaching this inquiry of why studying Black history and having lots of perspectives in our education is important, I felt, as a sociologist, I should approach it as a sociologist. And I'm a sociologist of many interests, but some of my primary interests tend to be in the areas of work as well as education. And in terms of thinking about this from the perspective of the sociology of education, I wanted to think about what it is that schools do, right? What does education do in a society? As a sociologist, and from a sociological perspective, I should say, we think about how society is structured by these broad social systems. We often call them social institutions that serve really important purposes and roles in terms of making sure a society functions. And education serves an incredibly important purpose. On the one hand, right, it provides knowledge, and it provides knowledge that's considered to be legitimate knowledge, things that people are supposed to know. Now, what gets considered legitimate might reflect the state or a whole host of other entities, but ultimately it's about knowledge that's considered legitimate, and there are decisions about what is considered legitimate and what is learned. But there are other things that schools do as well. Schools also serve in their own way as kind of a space, or almost like a training ground of sorts, for students to really learn about culture as well as their place in society. There's a lot of learning that happens in school contexts, right? Much of which is academic in nature, of course, but there's a lot of social learning that takes place too, as students are trying to figure out their place in the world vis-a-vis their peers and authority figures that may exist in those spaces. And so to think about what it means for Black history or perspectives to be untouched or understudied or sidelined to 1 month of the year, I wanted to think in relation to what we know about race and schooling and learning in a more general sense, what this may mean, right, in terms of what is actually happening in schools when it comes to race. So ultimately, as a sociologist, I think that, when we don't cover Black history or perspectives, or even just diverse history and perspectives in a very comprehensive way, what we may be doing is missing an opportunity for students and people in general to develop this broader understanding and comfort with issues of race. Right. And what's happening instead, and what we have to realize happens in schools, is that students are making sense of the social world and their position in it anyway. And that includes race. And it's happening earlier than folks may realize. There is research that documents how children as young as pre-K, I mean, I'm talking children as young as 3, recognize race as a socially significant marker and are trying to make sense of what it means. Now, their understandings, right, can, be a little muddled at times, right? They're still very young, but they are recognizing race as a socially significant concept and are trying to make sense of what things like race and ethnicity and language actually means. And in the absence of discussion from parents in some cases or in schools, students are left to make sense of it on their own. And they're making sense of it in their peer relationships. As children grow older, they're also taking note of how race operates in school spaces when it comes to like curriculum and tracking, for example. Right, with tracking, we're talking about a system where students are placed in different level classes for different subjects of study. But tracking also has a legacy of following some racial and ethnic patterns. Students pick up on that information. And it's part of what they're making sense of as they're making sense of their world in schools, but also how they're making sense of the world in general. Right? And research on youth and youth in education in particular document the ways that race is very much salient to them, but they're also taking into account their experiences at school to make sense of this. Right. So I mentioned tracking. That also does include curriculum. For instance, Epstein, I think it's Epstein 2000, finds that, students feel there's kind of a split in the way that if Black history or, if histories are covered, right, students of color may feel that his teaching history is exclusive to them, right? They're recognizing that, they're acknowledging that, and we're documenting that in research. So ultimately what's happening is that racial learning is happening in schools, whether we acknowledge it and address it or not, right? And as a sociologist, I wonder what opportunities we may be missing by not necessarily incorporating or by sidelining Black history or by thinking about history in a more diverse fashion. It's also important to think about what happens after, right, K-12. Right? We don't stop learning. We are teaching at a college, right? Where, education goes on beyond the K-12 level. And I reflected a bit on some of the scholarship of teaching and learning as it relates to college students. And in many ways, what the scholarship of teaching and learning documents parallel some of my experiences for a number of years teaching classes on race and ethnicity as a sociologist, right? As a sociologist, I'm interested in this because we do spend quite a bit of time talking about topics like race in our courses. But when those topics come up, something happens. There's a freeze, there's a pause, and an unsettled feeling may happen across the classroom or across the Zoom room, right? In terms of how we are doing this now. And this highlights a trend that is documented in the scholarship of teaching and learning, not just for teaching sociology classes, not just for teaching social science classes, but for teaching social work or history, right? In terms of addressing these issues more broadly. There is a marked resistance, right, to engaging these topics. And that resistance may result in kind of a failed class rapport where people become reticent to speak or are uncomfortable, may start to see less value in the class. It may be reflected in evaluations, right, of the instructor. There is some very real reaction that happens when these topics are brought up in college courses. Right. And as a sociologist, I recognize this as being potentially an outgrowth of a system where we don't necessarily talk about it along the way. Right. By the time we get to college, the information may be new, or students may come into the classroom having learned about race in different ways from different places, maybe from parents, maybe from schools, largely not school curriculum though. Right. So when students are bringing these different understandings into the class, there can be somewhat of a chilling effect in terms of really important learning and dialogue that can happen. And so as a sociologist, but also as a professor, right, I find it really important that we better integrate, right, in a more systematic way, diverse histories, talk about Black history, talk about Black perspectives, right? To talk about these histories so that we are in a better position to socialize kids, to have these tough conversations, and to be able to maybe better grapple with some of these issues, right? So when it comes to whether or not courses are beneficial. Of course, as a sociologist, I had to go digging for the evidence. And interestingly enough, a number of things that I found were anecdotal, which I think speaks in its own sort of like meta way to what we're talking about right now, right? If it's not in the curriculum, then it makes sense that there's not a whole lot of research that really can attest to and document the ways that teaching diverse histories can be beneficial. And I think that that's another form of loss that we have, right, in terms of our research. But there is some research that exists. And this research documents, both K-12 students, and some of it is from teaching and learning of college students as well. But the research that exists suggests that the classes are helpful. They can be extremely helpful for students of color who may feel more affirmed, right? That their experiences are being acknowledged in the classroom, that those conversations are necessary. It's important that it also come with rather culturally responsive curriculum that's sensitive to students' needs in general. But the historical aspect of it and just incorporating different perspectives in the curriculum can be beneficial. And it's not just beneficial to students of color as well, right? With the research that does exist, indicates that white students can find value, right, in learning these perspectives as well. So even though we may have some rather limited research evidence, and I think the anecdotal information is important as well, because this is where we're learning about how this actually works for instructors. There's evidence that it's meaningful, it's important to students. And as a sociologist, I think, as we think in systems and structures and patterns, it's important that to develop a pattern in teaching of incorporating broad perspectives, because there are some places where social learning is happening that we are missing the mark, and we may be setting up students to be further challenged in talking about these dynamics later on. All right, so that is it for me. I'm going to turn this over to Courtney, who is going to talk a bit about the importance when it comes to healthcare.
All right, thank you. I am going to try and share my screen here. How are we doing? Okay, great. Okay, all right. Okay, I don't know how many of you were able to, although if some of my students are listening, we all joined Paige and Tracy on Monday to talk about disability rights. And one of the first things that they did was review the history of the particular population that they were talking about. And I think that's sort of highlights what we're trying to talk about here, that if you're trying to understand or include or increase access or equity, one of the most important parts of understanding that is trying to get some context or some history. So while I have a specific discipline of occupational therapy, I'm going to try and broadly talk about healthcare in general. And so when we think about healthcare professionals, we think about folks that are working in health and healthcare services. Now, each discipline have their own standards of practice, how they go about doing what it is that they do. and a framework for how they do that. But in general, practitioners really try to do no harm first. And then to try and be of benefit, that their service is of benefit. And so we want to make sure that all of us as practitioners are doing no harm and providing benefit. So what I do as a practitioner and now as an educator of practitioners is to try and examine the disparities between our standards of practice and outcomes. So what does the standard say that I am doing? And then am I actually doing those things? And so that's kind of what I want to talk about in terms of what we say we do, and then how are we doing on it in terms of health equity. Okay, so the first thing that we try to do as professionals is I need to learn how to do this job, and I need to do what is, I want to be competent. I want to be a competent practitioner. And so the way that, how can I be competent in working with a wide variety of folks? And so I'm going to talk about the three main ways that healthcare professionals look at what they might call culturally responsive care. And so the first concept is what is called cultural competence. And it really is focused on a set of objectives. And while this is definitely beneficial, the idea of competency, it implies that there's an end, that there's a finality to it, that I learn these things, I take these classes, I read these whatevers, and then I am competent. And so for me, there's, and for a lot of folks, there's some lacking here in the idea of just looking for cultural competency. So the next concept is what is referred to as cultural humility. And we were talking earlier about, so I, as a white person, may be able to work towards some really deep listening and asking about and curiosity about others' experiences. But it's my responsibility to understand that I will never have those. I can't have those things. So I can't be the expert in somebody else's life. And so the focus of cultural humility is to realize that it's a lifelong process. The focus is on continuous practice, and the continuous practice for me, and the continuous practice of having an awareness and an openness of what are my own experiences and what aren't my experiences. And how do I distinguish those two things? It's also focused on, so, a practitioner internal ongoing assessment for improvement. The healthcare field traditionally spends a lot of time trying to fix the people and fix the illness and all of these types of things, and spends little time focusing on fixing the deliverers of the care. And so when you're focusing on cultural humility, one of the tenets is that there's an ongoing fixing of, or assessing or improving of the practitioner themselves through a shared experience and a shared power dynamic. The other issue that happens a lot is when we're the experts, we want to come in and tell the people who are not experts all of the things that they should do and all of the advice that they should follow. And this practice does a little bit more of the sharing of the power dynamic and shifting of the expertise to the patient and away from the practitioner, to the client and away from the professional. The last method or tenet is called trauma-informed care. And it sort of highlights the prevalence of trauma in our society. So that, and it recognizes that exists. And so oftentimes what people think of trauma, they think of, an injury, they were in a car accident, or they were injured during war, they're a veteran, those types of things. And trauma-informed care really looks at just the trauma that exists in our society, and that how those structures affect the health outcome, how various people experience various levels of trauma just in their everyday lives. And if we don't have, we as practitioners don't have a better understanding of that and some language around that, that we're missing a big piece, a really essential piece. The other thing that I really like about this concept is that there is more of a shared interaction between the patient and the client. And that, I think on the next slide, yeah, we talk about the importance of history as part of a personal context. So this slide, this graphic kind of highlights the importance of how we experience life as humans, and that it is really important for people to feel safe, to feel supported, and to feel understood. And so it also highlights the importance of history and culture and mutuality and collaboration. So it is my job as a healthcare practitioner and an educator of healthcare practitioners to make sure that I am aware that there are times where students in my class or patients in my clinic don't feel naturally safe, supported, or understood. And that's my responsibility. And so what are some of the things that I need to be aware of? Okay, the next piece of this is, so we looked at practitioners and what are our roles. Now I want to talk about how are we doing? So what are the outcomes of all of these practices that we are trying to do? And we take a look at what we call social determinants of health. And there are these 5 categories that we look at. And so economic stability, education, health and healthcare, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context. And so all of these factors are considered or need to be considered or should be considered when you are thinking about health and how health is determined. And how access to each of these things impacts one's health. One of the things that I think is really essential is that in health and healthcare, we don't always consider health. We usually consider health as the absence of disease. We're missing a lot if that's the way that we consider things. So I just wanted to throw this chart up because when I look at this, I can't help but notice how all of these things that we're talking about today and also during Democracy Days intersect with health and healthcare delivery. And so one of the webinars that I went to over the summer was about looking at racism as a social determinant of health. And I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But one of the presenters talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and how he looked at, or one of the ways that he described, and he was a social scientist, so I want to, he doesn't belong to us, unfortunately, talked about looking at people or groups of people as 5 distinct fingers that make up a hand. And so that it is important to understand and value and recognize the contribution of each of the fingers. And that in conjunction, that all of those things are necessary in order to make the hand work. Okay. So when I am thinking about being an expert in my field, one of the questions that I ask for when I'm engaged in either a class or in a therapy session, I think about who are the experts. And the most important thing for me to remember is that the patients or the students are the experts of their lives. That I'm the expert of my own life, and that is an important distinction for all practitioners to remember. And the importance of understanding the gaps in my experience and the gaps in my knowledge. And the two things that come to my mind immediately are bias and education, and the impacts on the delivery of healthcare. And so the results of the studies, when they studied bias and the effects on delivery, showed that implicit bias was significantly related to patient and provider interactions, to the treatment decisions that we make, to the adherence of the treatment that we prescribe to patients, and their health outcomes. So in all of the parts. And that implicit attitudes were more significantly related to patient-provider interactions and health outcomes. And so what to me that says is that practitioners with shared experiences they always have the best outcomes. And so we kind of talked about representation in literature. Representation in healthcare is also really essential. Because I am the expert in my own life and the experiences that I have, the patients who are closest to me will have the best outcomes. And that if I am trying to dole out some advice or come up with a treatment plan to a patient that doesn't share my experience and I haven't acknowledged that in any way, why would anybody listen to what I have to say? I've missed a big opportunity and the very real truth that the patient is in fact the expert of their own life. And so the care needs to be centered around the patient, not centered around the practitioner. It's not my job to come in and tell you how smart I am. It is my job to come in and actively listen, be deeply interested in the things that are important to you. And what are the barriers for you? And we're going to talk about that next. Okay, so the idea of health and health equity talks about all of the places where health exists. And health starts where we live, learn, work, and play. So all of the places. And the conditions under which people live and work have more than 5 times the effect on our health than all the medical errors and snafus and all of those things. So to me, that says we got a lot of work to do in the healthcare field and just the delivery itself as individual practitioners. But boy, we also have a lot of work to do in looking at all of those other areas, where people live and work, where people play. What are the things that are impacting their health and their access to health? So, and also how we educate healthcare professionals about health, access to healthcare, barriers to equal attainment. It needs to be part of the greater conversation. And in that, the webinar that I went to on racism as a social determinant of health, they are saying, which is completely and totally true, that data itself is really stagnant. So we have all of this data that says we're not doing a good job here, that, you know, people are not being able to access health equally. There's loads and loads and loads of data and evidence that says, and racism is a huge factor in this. There's lots of data that says that. And so while lots of data is important, the most important part is what to do with that data, how to use that data to act. And so they were calling for making racial health equity content mandatory in all healthcare programs instead of elective. It really seems like one of the only choices we can make, and specifically Black history. And this is, again, one of the many reasons why I think this conversation is really essential, and I'm grateful to be able to participate. So my job as a healthcare professional and as an educator of healthcare professionals is to focus both on direct service. So how can I look at my curriculum, the way I teach, the stories that we tell, the pictures that we use, the languages in our curriculum, the language in our syllabus, all of those things. And also, how can we work to address the policies that create those barriers to equal access? So the medical model is pretty limited. The social model helps us look at those other social conditions, but it's really the social justice model and the model of occupational justice where the focus is on equity and what are those barriers and what can we do to sort of close those gaps or to try to address those barriers so everybody can lead their best lives possible. Okay, and there are my references. Okay, so last but not least, of course, is Professor Marvin Tobias, and he's gonna take us home. Thanks so much.
I was looking at the time and I noticed that we have a lot of questions. So what I would actually like to do, I'd like to get into some of the questions because there are quite a few, and I think that some of my comments can relate to specifically the questions. And then I do have a comment that I can end with when we do close it out that relates more to the ridiculousness, how ridiculous it is that we even have to have conversations about why there has to be an inclusion of African American in any type of curriculum to begin with. I guess the only thing I can actually say for this point is that when we deal with addiction, which are about 20 million, dealing with 20 million addiction issues every year that can then lead to overdose, we create a DARE program to help with that. But then there's a fight when you're dealing with 33 million African Americans just to literally add or insert or change a curriculum that we know is beneficial as part of our particular society and our civil responsibility. We just give a lot of lip service, but you know what? I'll deal with that later. Let's get to some of the questions, and then I'll end my piece. So that's Grace and Courtney and Dana. You can take the mics, and we can get through some of these questions here because I've looked at some of them, and they're pretty good.
I clearly spent too much time on the mic, so
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
I think the first question that came in was, how can we encourage conversations with our peers that believe racism has already been solved? And oh, good Lord, this is a question, right? I deal with this on a daily basis as a history teacher. The only thing that I could say is to tell them that the history that they've been taught is a myth. There's a lot of myth in that American curriculum of history. Like what you're taught in your classes is determined by a school board, which is a political position, and they are chosen by their community. And that system has meant that white supremacy has been incorporated into your textbooks. So no, racism is not resolved. And then you can very simply show them the whole history. If you don't have time for that, and they're genuinely interested in learning, I would direct them to some documentaries that can explain this. I think a really great documentary is 13th on Netflix. It's by Ava DuVernay. And she goes through the 13th Amendment and basically just shows how slavery never ended in America. It was just replaced with a different system. If you can get them to take a history class, tell them to take an African American history class. Everybody should be learning that perspective. We also have a Latin American history class and a Native American history class. I agree with Rachel, and these should not be like subjects that are on the sidelined. I think they should be included in our curriculum, which I do attempt to do. But it is still important that we have it otherwise. Because does anybody else have any other resources that they would recommend for talking about real history with their friends?
I don't really have a real history resource to talk with my friends. I just know that from the psychology of it, what we do find is that when you do talk to individuals who are adamant in the disbelief that racism exists, and you do try and speak at them regarding the proof that it's there, it actually hardens the position in the opposite direction. And so it actually creates more resistance to it. And so sometimes what people do is they do more of a storytelling versus I'm going to try and prove you, but try and present a story that they can relate to. It then transition over to how it links to racism or some prejudicial belief or attitude. It then build it up from there because, well, we do find that people actually are more resistant the more you talk to them about it.
Right. That is a problem that I run into on a regular basis. I find that if you can help that person, it's almost like you're getting cognitive behavioral therapy. And here's my psychology background here. If you can get that person to come to the realization themselves, like just by presenting the information and connecting the dots, then it's less of you attacking them and more like them just becoming open to that realization. But that is a difficult thing to do for sure.
It's really because their worldview, you're challenging a worldview, and a worldview gives purpose. And so when that purpose is challenged, they're no, and it's like, all right.
Yeah, and it is a really personal thing. I think people get defensive because a lot of times when you talk about racism in society, because they don't understand systemic racism and ways that the government has actually put this into our legal practices, into our criminal justice system, into our laws, into our everyday lives, they think that the only way that they're racist is if they're walking around saying the N-word or they're a member of the KKK. but it's acknowledging racism that's deep-seated. It's the history that's within our system. If you are interested, I'm not trying to like totally plug my next session, but tomorrow at 1 for Democracy Days, I'm going to be talking about some of the institutional racism and symbols of racism within our county and in our city, and that includes St. Louis and St. Charles County. So I'm going to give a little overview of that if you're looking for some tools. I don't want to take up too much time with it today. Are you guys ready to go to another question? Does anybody have any comments? Okay. So I like this question. Do we have racism and xenophobia in St. Charles County? I think the answer is yes. Do anybody want to, do we need to say anything more to that? And how do we combat the belief that history is irrelevant for everyday racism? Some Americans think that the re-education of previously whitewashed textbook is living in the past. I feel that way. It's like, but how will we really know history, Grace, if we take down Confederate statues? That's the same question, right? Same principle behind that. Isn't that the point of history, to learn the past? I mean, the nice thing about history is that learning the past can help you change the present and understand the present. Anyone else want to take that one? I saw Dana took her mute off.
Yeah, I'll speak to that for a second because I sometimes get this question as well. I tend to take a socio-historical view when I talk a bit about racism in my courses. And one of the things that I point out, especially when talking about policies like redlining and talking about racial housing segregation, is that while, yes, we can think of this as the past, when we think about the generational importance, right, what we learn, what we inherit, 50, 60 years ago is only a couple of generations, right? So in terms of like measuring it in lived like lifespans, what seems to be the distant past is the not so distant past if we think about it generationally, right? So we acknowledge the importance of generations when we're talking about traditions or, what was passed down to us. Well, that is also important when we are talking about history and racism as well. And I think that we have to acknowledge that the past is not as distant as we may want to believe.
Yeah, one of the presenters at that panel said, the more we interrogate our past, the more effective our future will be. I think that when you are looking at multiple perspectives of the past, that's when we talk about history. If not all of the perspectives have been considered, then we can't look at or recognize some of the patterns, and we don't have much of a choice, or we can't make an informed decision, as well of an informed decision about future or present.
Oh, go ahead, Marvin.
Going back to my storytelling and narratives, how do you combat the belief? It's like, I love my parents, I love my grandparents, I love my great-grandparents. And it's like, when I interact with someone who's thinking like it's totally relevant how their history goes, I'm like, if you love your parents and you love your grandparents, how much would it affect you to know that their life expectancy was shortened because someone's misbelief or bias towards treating someone with Africa who thinks that they don't have as much pain or not going to follow through with procedure? And so you love your parents. They could have lived till they were 70, but they lived till they were 60. Why? Because of racist ideology, biases toward giving them treatment for something. So I lost 10 years with my parents. I lost 10 years with my grandparents. Would you want to look at your children and say, you know what, your lifespan is going to be shortened because someone holds a belief that because of the color of your skin, you're less likely to follow through with medical advice? So I'm cutting the lifespan of my children shorter. So when someone tells me that it's irrelevant, I'm going to walk them through. No, I will show you how it is relevant by impacting or talking about the narrative of their particular life. And the sad part, that's actually the reality. It's like study after study after study after study demonstrates the different beliefs and how that leads to different treatment, how that leads to different success from pregnancy to expiration. The whole, that's what I would say. I got to turn my mic off. Hold on.
Okay, so I'm going to read these. Hey, sorry, my dog. I'm going to read these comments all together because I think they're all relevant to each other. It says, I feel that the College District Board of Trustees religiously discriminates. Oh, sorry, there's the first one. Do we have present systemic racism in the St. Charles Community College district system? I feel that the College District Board of Trustees religiously discriminates against members of our St. Charles community. We have no diversity other than older white women on the College District Board of Trustees. And it says the culture of SCC does not truly include minority representation on committees or councils that are for diversity and inclusion. Why is that? And then another person said, so let's address first the Board of Trustees, because I think that's a big one, right? And I'll try not to get myself in trouble with this one too.
You'll get fired on your day off? Okay.
It is true that all of our Board of Trustees are white. We have 3 women on the board, but everyone there is white. So I don't know if anyone, I mean, I think if you look, I think one of the other questions is how do we change this? So I think that's a good way to approach it. So I'll leave that you guys. I have some ideas, but I'm wondering if you guys have anything. It is an elected position, right? So we can't change who's on the Board of Trustees. Voters
it taps into
district can.
It taps into the broader who lives in the particular area, who makes the decisions in the particular area, which goes into the history of the development of Cotterville, St. Charles itself.
Yeah.
So the system actually, it's reciprocating itself. So literally to add diversity to the Board of Trustees, you literally have to change the surroundings of the individuals who actually have power and influence in the community itself, which the Board of Trustees matches those halls of influence.
Mm-hmm. Come to my panel tomorrow to learn more about the history of St. Charles County and racism that's been in our county and how we can address it. I think acknowledgement is important because there are people today who still refuse to acknowledge that racism exists and that actions that have been systemically racist and put in policies in place that affect generations, that it's real. And I think that that is a problem when people can't even say that it's real. Because again, they view this as, it's not racist unless I say the N-word in public. It's okay if I say it to myself quietly or to my family or the people who really know me that I don't mean anything bad by it. But I'm not a racist. I'm not a member of the KKK without really acknowledging that bias and the discrimination that exists on an everyday basis for people in St. Louis.
Yeah.
It's not just St. Charles County, it's everywhere here. We are a slave state. We are the South. I used to think, oh, it wasn't so bad. We're not Southerners, but we are. Like that is the story of Missouri. But not just that, it doesn't matter where you go in the United States. It's everywhere. It's not a North and South problem. It's everywhere. So it's when people have been systemically blocked from having representation, this is the result.
Yeah, one of the panelists was talking about this same, the concept of systemic racism is it doesn't necessarily require people to be actively racist all the time, that the system is just on autopilot now. And so I, as a white person, I can see how people want to say, well, I'm a really nice person. That's not what anybody is saying. Nobody is saying you're nice or not nice. And that people are equating racism and racial structures to whether or not people are kind or nice. And what this panel specifically was trying to say is that systemic racism is just like ingrained and built, and it is just on autopilot now. And so in order to dismantle that, part of it is to look at it, and then part of it is to possess the power to make the change. And I think this is what we were talking about in terms of the board and in terms of people who are in positions of power, that the people who are in positions of power are the ones who are able to make the changes. And so either put
They
new
don't want to
people
make a
in
change,
power.
so
No.
Yeah.
they don't want to. So that answers question 4 and question 5. There's no real desire or drive to make a change. There's a desire and drive to give lip service, but there's no real desire and drive to actually look within self, to actually see what policies and procedures are in place, which discourages the recreation of the same system and actually to disrupt it. So really, there's no desire, it's just lip service.
I did want to say, if I could add,
Sure.
the idea, the importance of stories too, because I know this can feel daunting, this conversation of like, what the heck do we do when the power structure, like the water we're swimming in, is effectively tainted with racism, right? Like that is part of our environment, among other things. But to remember to do the work yourself. And I am speaking again, in part to the privileged white audience, right? Of like doing the reading and investigating what race means to you, because there's a line in Morrison where she says, like, we know he's white because they never tell us. There's a problem with race seeming invisible unless it is like an ethnicity that isn't white, right? Race impacts everyone. So I think it could be a powerful thing for a person to go in where, regardless of your identifiable race, I'm pretty sure people who aren't white have already thought about race, but like getting more engaged with that, reading more stories. It sounds so simplistic, but talking about it, I tell you to talk about it with your children at a young age. Be vocal about this. It's supposed to cause so much anxiety in us. Why? Because, well, it is built in the system. We're not really meant to be challenging it. That discomfort is the only place that growth can come, both to individual, to big things. I don't want us to lose all hope here, though it is pretty bleak and all reaching. All right, I'll stop now.
I'm not going to really go into great detail about some of the comments about problems on our own campus. I think that we've all been dealing with that same feeling. I think that it's lip service a little bit. So I don't want to talk because I'm not an expert in that and the things that have been done on campus, but I do know that there are discussions happening on campus, and I'm hopeful that we can get something that's real in place. But I don't want to go into too much detail that because we're running out of time, and there's some other really good questions in here. I wanted to address this one. This one was to Courtney, but I think it connects to, I think all of us can talk about it. But there are proven disparities in healthcare for people of color in this country, from subpar treatment to undesirable methods to lack of proper pain management due to bias. How do you actively combat that as an educator of practitioners? And then I want to connect it to a question that came in a little bit later than that too, that said, what are your thoughts on the almost sympathetic response to the opioid addiction in comparison to the criminalization of crack in the 80s? So I think that addresses both of those as bias within the medical community. And how do you, as an educator of these future practitioners, address that, Courtney?
Well, the first thing that we do is talk about bias. And I provide them with examples of my own experiences of my own bias in my practice and what the outcomes of that were. And when in each assignment where we are looking at a case study, one of the questions is always, what is the culturally responsive care? What are the things that you need to consider? Because this is a muscle or a habit, just like everything else, is that because I am not the expert in this, I'm only the expert in my own life, the work is constant. And the recognition that I only know my experience is only mine, and is a constant practice. And so just like forming any other habit, you have to have constant practice in every opportunity that there is.
Can I ask you about that? Do you guys, you said about all the data that's showing that disparity in treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you discuss that data with your students and make them aware about it. I mean, like, I think that's a lot of it, is understanding history of how African Americans have been treated. I mean, the fact that African Americans couldn't be treated at white hospitals up until like the 60s and 70s. I mean, like, that is a really long legacy of medical discrimination, or the fact that slaves were experimented on, and that's how we get modern medical procedures without the consent. I mean, is there a discussion of that in your classes? Because I feel like that would be something that could help your students understand, or even, like Marvin was saying, personal stories.
Yes, absolutely. And I found that instead of me saying, look at this research, saying, this is the situation. What are the social determinants of health that were impacted here? I want the students to find the research. So to ask that, to find because they need to educate themselves about this stuff too. So the more actively they are participating, the better it is. So yes, we talk about those things, and the way treatment gets decided, and all of the studies that they use to decide what treatments are beneficial. The participants of that treatment in the studies are often white men, and so our bodies are different, our hormones are different, like we have different parts, and all of that stuff. Plus, we have come from different contexts, and so there's a lot of work to be done. And I do want to just say talking about the opioid addiction, this is a perfect example of when the experience happens to white people. They're like, oh man, drugs are, this is probably a really big deal. And, talking about crack, but also talking about, the criminalization of marijuana, like all of these things that once the experience is shared with the people who are in positions of power, then we're like, oh, whoa, white people don't like this. And so that is tends to be the driver, because those folks we are in the positions of power, which is one of the other reasons that I think talking about disability is can be a really good sort of gateway, because disability intersects all of this, that it isn't, and that there are, while there are factors that can make disabilities greater, the experience, white folks can experience disability, and not being able to access places and all of those types of things. So it gives a little possibility for some personal experience.
We are out of time, unfortunately. I thought that was really good discussions. Marvin, was there anything that you wanted to say to send us out? Because you said you wanted to have like a final comment, because you didn't get to talk as long as everybody else. It's okay if you don't.
I think there were good comments. I wish we could have responded to all the comments. There is some mentality that's a change on the college campus, but it just reflects the society in general or at large. I really just believe that when you talk about the subject matter in general, and we link it to Democracy Days, which is basically having an informed citizenship, by definition, you want to include everyone who's actually classified, not even classified, anyone should know about the particular history. And I think, going back again, there's not really a lot of change because people don't want the change. They want to maintain how the system is. It's just, I will end with this one. There was a study done in 2019, a survey of parents on what they want their kids to read. And people want to talk about diversity. And so they asked the parents how important it was to read diverse books. 47% of white parents said it was important, which means 53% said like, it's not that important. And the parents wished that there were more books available that include diversity. 39% of white parents said we wish that that was the case, which means most didn't. Now for African Americans, Hispanic, biracial, they all wanted books that show diversity. So it literally, I mean, it's literally baked into the system. So I don't really have anything to add. It is our civic responsibility to include multiple perspectives when we educate individuals. It's, oh gosh, I got nothing, man. I got nothing. But I will say that tomorrow in the panel regarding racism and Black Lives Matter, I'm actually just going to give a whole list of all the biases that a lot of different biases that exist literally against, which we classify as anti-Black, from prenatal to expiration, which actually supports how racism is baked in the American ideal. But that's not anti-American either. That's all I got.
On that note, thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure to be with all these panelists. Thank you, Michael.
Outstanding job, folks. Thank you. This was really good.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks.